Hi and welcome back. Today's tutorial is for a nice simple exercise that's suitable for beginners. I'm using just two colours to paint this sort of misty Lake District scene with this beautiful old-fashioned boat. The two colours I'm using are ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Most people have those, so hopefully beginners will. And please feel free to scale it down to a much smaller painting than mine here. Mine is 11 inches by 15 inches or 28 centimetres by 38 centimetres. And then if you scale it down, the smaller you paint it as a beginner, the easier it would be for you to control your washes. And obviously scale down your brushes. A sort of medium flat brush would do for the sky, and any small rigger or small pointed brush for the finer details. So you can see here, in order to simplify the photograph from Pixabay, reference is in the description below, I've just drawn out a simple horizon line a third of the way up the page, very faint, and the bare outlines of this boat, and then I've painted the boat in with masking fluid. That will help to preserve the shape of the boat while I then can enjoy painting some very loose free wet in wet washes. So wet your page all over and then mix up your two colours, mix up plenty of paint, and the two colours together, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, will create varying shades of grey. Once you get a shade of grey that you like for this sort of misty, murky sky and sea, then just using the horizontal brush strokes and reloading with paint as necessary, keep introducing a bit more paint across the top. The board is at an angle of about 30 to 45 degrees. So that means the paint is flowing down the page wet in wet, and you can see it's gently diffusing and giving me this beautiful subtly graduated wash. And if I trust to the process now, lay the board flat and let it dry without fiddling or touching it, I should end up with a really beautiful, clean, graduated wash that will give me both my sea and my sky. And it's quite simple, the sort of thing that you may have to practice a bit, but it's worth practicing these techniques because it can create some really effective paintings. And once the painting is bone dry, and it has to be completely dry, we're going to use a bit of masking tape, ordinary decorators masking tape, and stick it across the horizon line, sort of just below, so that we can create a nice straight island or rocky outcrop. And here you see where I've positioned it. Now, before you start painting, check that your masking tape doesn't tear your paper. Some cheaper types of paper, masking tape will tear it when you try to remove it. You can get around this by gently warming up the masking tape with a hairdryer before, and then carefully peeling it back. The warmth from the hairdryer just seems to release the glue. You can also see that I've penciled in my headland, and that's just following the photograph and simplifying that shape. So it just gives the impression of that rocky outcrop stretching across about 2/3 of the water line. And then mix up a drier mix of grey, tending to the slightly warmer side, so it's got a bit more burnt sienna in it and less water, so you get a fairly rich dark covering, and then going over your masking fluid over the boat, because the masking fluid protects it. Paint in the whole of the headland and keep loading up your brush with more paint each time, so that you can pull it across this headland and keep the colour sort of fairly consistent. It doesn't matter if there's some variation or some tonal differences in this. This will all add to the kind of illusion of something going on in the landscape, so the undulations of land, maybe sort of rocky parts, grassy areas, that sort of thing. And then with my small calligraphy brush, or any small brush that you've got with a good tip, just pull out a few, while the paint's still wet, pull out a few sort of loose, rough, scruffy little lines or blobs that look a little bit like the impressions of small trees growing up out of that headland. And then let that dry completely, and once it's dry you can go over it with the same mixture of paint, and this acts as a glaze, and so it darkens up this headland even more with 2 layers. Because watercolour is transparent, if you keep layering up with glazes onto a bone dry painting, then you'll end up with darker shades, and any areas that are unglazed will just show through as slightly paler and add a bit more variety. Again, using your largish round brush for good coverage and making sure you mix up plenty of paint before you start to paint this in, so you get good coverage of the whole thing, and then leaving it to dry completely. And then we'll be removing the masking tape. So remember to warm up the masking tape with a hairdryer first if you've got any concerns about whether it might stick. Or if it starts to stick to the paper as you peel it up gently, then get the hairdryer and warm it up, and then gently pull away the warm tape and you should be fine. Now you can see I've got a reasonably straight horizon, but I have ended up with a little bit of seepage below the tape. That can sometimes happen if it's not been stuck down firmly across that top edge. But I can turn this area here into another headland, because that's where the main seepage is. So in order to create a new headland, I just need another glaze of that stronger colour mixed with the 2 colours, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, that's the one, and just bring it down a tiny amount lower than that water line that I've got already, covering up the little bit of seepage. If you do get seepage, then as I say, don't panic, you can just go over it and create this new headland. I mean, there isn't one in the photograph, but that doesn't matter. We're using our artistic license to use the photo as inspiration more than anything. And you can see now that by glazing over the dry painting with this rich mixture of the 2 colours, this nice dark blackish grey, and then putting in again the hints of a few little trees on the top. Once that dries back, it should look like a fairly convincing island or headland sticking out a little bit closer than the one that we painted previously. And then lightly going over along the bottom with my flat brush and just correcting the tiny bit of seepage that I got there, and making sure that that waterline is nice and straight. If you don't have any seepage, miss this one out, and hopefully you won't. I wasn't expecting it, but it does sometimes happen, so it's good to be prepared and be fairly flexible if you can, rather than worrying and thinking that it's ruined, because it isn't. You can usually think on your feet and work around any little sort of happy accidents that happen. So now looking back at the photograph and lightly penciling in another distant mountain or island, just simplifying it from the photograph. And this is the last one that I'm going to do. There are more in the photograph and you can put more in if you like, and the trick here is to mix up very watery paint, much paler grey, much more transparent. And as you can see here, it's much paler than this main headland. And what happens is that pale, cool colours recede. The warmer, stronger colours come forward. So what we're doing is we're creating aerial perspective and distance. And also, please note that I've got the waterline for this further headland just a tiny amount higher than the main one. And like bringing the front headland down a bit further, this creates depth and distance and aerial perspective. It's a very simple way of creating a lot of depth in your painting. Now we need to paint the boat, so rub off the masking fluid as I've done here with a clean finger, or use an eraser or the tacky part of a piece of masking tape, and remove the latex. And now we can paint the boat using the darkest mixture we can make, and quite rich, hardly any water added to the paint, so it's nice and dark. The two colours again, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, make almost a black colour when they're rich and deep like this. And then using any small brush with a good point, carefully fill in the hull of the boat, and then put a couple of little dots or marks in for the sailors. I've used a very small calligraphy brush with a good point, but any small brush that you've got good control when you use is ideal for this, to carefully get the shape right. So now for the sail, and I've mixed up a good rich, not very watery, so creamy mixture of just the burnt sienna, and I'm going to paint in the sail. Now at this point, if you prefer the sail to be white, then obviously leave this stage out, because the white looks pretty attractive against the grey hills. So you could leave that out and maybe instead just paint the mast using the burnt sienna, and I think that would look quite attractive too. But I like the old-fashioned sort of rusty brown colour of those old-fashioned sails on these beautiful sailing boats. So filling in the smaller sail slightly darker, and then adding a bit of blue to the creamy mixture of burnt sienna, just to darken it up a tiny bit, but to keep it looking quite this sort of rusty brown. Just to add a bit of shade and tone into the sail. I've decided to keep the lake water completely flat, just like this. I'm not going to add any texture or ripples to it, but of course intermediates can do that if they wish to. But for beginners, I think it's really nice to do sort of a less is more painting, and just put in a minimal amount of reflection from the sail and the boat itself. So I'm using the tips of my flat brush and the same dark colour as I painted the hull, and just touching the tips to create sort of a few horizontal lines that join in places that kind of imitate the shape of the hull. Still got a little bit of that watercolour shining through between them, and then swapping out to the burnt sienna and echoing the shape of the mast, but just using these horizontal lines with gaps between them so that you can see the watercolour shining through. So that's the painting just about finished, but I want to finish off the boat with a little bit more detail, and I'm going to use a fine liner for this. It's a fine 0.5 Pigma Micron fine liner, and I'm going to just sharpen up a bit of the detail in the boat. It's very small, so it's much easier to do this with a fine liner rather than trying to paint it in. So I've put in kind of like a strut for the sail, a horizontal one below the large sail. I've darkened up each side of the mast and given it a bit of definition. I'll paint in, I will draw in a little bit of a flag too on the top of the mast. Maybe outline around the sail a bit more, just to, as I say, give a bit more definition. Sort of just a bit of something and nothing, some lines running from the sail to the boat in various places. And that's it, the painting is finished. And for quite a simple painting that consists of a few processes thought through and then put together with leaving drying time between the different stages, I think this is a painting that most beginners would find really enjoyable to paint and end up with a very attractive result. I think it's also a really good practice exercise for beginners. practicing wet in wet graduated washes, and also using a limited palette of 2 colours to colour mix various shades and tones of grey, and then using the burnt sienna to add a real pop of colour to the focal point, and then finally adding a few finishing touches with the fine liner to further define the focal point, which is of course our centre of interest and where the viewer's eye is drawn to. Well, thanks so much for watching. I hope that was helpful. Please leave us a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.